I guess we can start. It's a minute past one local time. I'm really happy to welcome you all to the next talk in the Sustain Era Research Talks series. So this is our third talk. Um, and I'm more than happy to introduce our speaker. He's Tommaso Gimelli, who's currently a researcher at the Department for Public Finance and Infrastructure Policy at TU Wien, where he works for the Horizon Europe project, so MountResilience, and also he's a PhD student, so he's working on his PhD research on climate adaptation strategies for mountain regions. Estonia, as you all know, is a very flat country. The highest point is called Munamägi, which is the X hill, and it's 317 meters, but it's from a sea level. So when you actually go there, it doesn't look that impressive at all because it's already like on an elevated piece of land. So Estonia is a fairly low land, so mountains maybe are not that sort of relevant for us. But Tommaso, in his talk, he's going to talk about his project, but also he's going to talk about how the presented insights might be relevant and applicable to different contexts, such as Estonia, for instance, and projects which aim at integrating sustainability research across different disciplines into actionable policy frameworks. So the talk is entitled From Enabling Conditions to Impact, Tracking Transformative Climate Adaptation in Mountain Areas. And based on the talk description, I'm absolutely certain it's going to be very relevant to our Sustainera projects as well as anyone interested in this field. So this short introduction, welcome to Masa. Thank you so much for inviting our invitation, and we are looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, Anu. Thank you for the kind introduction. I will share my slides. Thank you very much, Anu, once again. As you were saying, I'm working as a project assistant and PhD candidate at TU Wien. I will jump directly into it. So I mostly work within the MountResilience project, and particularly our task in my research department is to develop an impact assessment framework. Just a few words about MountResilience. This is an Horizon project, part of the mission on adaptation, and we work mostly with 10 mountainous regions across Europe, of which 6 are really our focus, the ones marked in green in our map. So you can see we have Lapland, Tyrol, Valais, Piedmont, Arasdului, and Gabrovo. So also very different contexts, both in terms of geography, political systems, and etc. So what we are trying to do here is really to create an impact assessment framework that can be applicable to these different conditions. And for these, I'm also fairly confident this could be interesting also for applications beyond mountainous regions. We mostly root our framework into a social, ecological, technical systems approach. We'll say a bit more about this later on. And we try to integrate quantitative indicators and qualitative narratives, adopting this mixed approach to measurement, in which we try explicitly to avoid reductionist approaches, that is reducing everything to just quantitative metrics, even though we recognize the value of this. And in particular, the project works on transformative change, which is somewhat different than what's called incremental change or incremental adaptation or even maladaptation. So just as a working definition, we can take the IPCC, saying that transformation is a system-wide change that requires more than technological change for consideration of social economic factors that with technology can bring about rapid change at scale. So the focus here is really not to focus on small patches to the system, so small technical fixes, but rather to work on regions as these complex systems. And I will go back into this in a second. First of all, why is assessing adaptation impact so difficult? And in general, what issues do we face in this literature? We see that adaptation outcomes are often context dependent, multiscalar, and slow to materialize, which compared to other project literature poses additional challenges. And traditionally, metrics often capture the outputs of these processes and not really the process, which is something we try to also address in our framework. With the idea that transformation is really about this sort of walking path and not only arriving somewhere, but really matters also how we arrive somewhere. We, of course, have the issue of comparability between different governance types or socio-ecological settings, also geographical conditions. And in general, as researchers, I guess, we know that policy demand at the moment is there's a huge demand for evidence-based scaling and prioritization. So the need for somewhat hard proof of how these projects develop. And this goes hand in hand somewhat with this traditional strong focus on technocratic implementation, which we see, or we argue, that often results in incremental adaptation or maladaptation. So the fact that a large share of adaptation projects worldwide at the moment fail to really meet their initial objectives, or even end up worsening the situation. So a few words on social, technical, ecological systems. As I said, we should start from this maybe more theoretical perspective and understand innovation processes, of which transformative collaborative adaptation falls into, as these processes happening across different scales. So on the left, we see these sort of intercommunicating systems at global, regional, and local level. And within each of these spheres, we have these different pillars, so social, technological, and ecological systems that through feedback loops feed into each other. And generally, we should always consider these complex dynamics and feedback loops while planning for transformative adaptation, while also considering temporal dynamics. Moving to the right, we see these interactions between these different spheres, in which, for example, we should also try to address explicitly power relations among actors, so recognizing that actors within regions have different influence over policy. We have these bottom-up and top-down processes that need to be negotiated in some way, and this provision of goods and services, which might assume different arrangements across different governance systems. And so we see this huge wheel of embedded governance, which is it's created both by formal norms and institutions, so laws, legislation, etc., but also informal arrangements and dynamics within different stakeholders. This particular has been developed for urban socio-ecological technical systems. This is an issue we generally have, that a lot of sustainability research focuses on cities for different reasons, but generally we face somewhat of a lack of frameworks that address more explicitly rural or non-urban contexts, including in our case, mountainous, but not only those. Talking about working definitions, so we might try to give a simple definition of what we mean by impact assessment in order to all be on the same page. So impact assessment for us mostly deals with this cause and effect relationship. So trying to understand and casually link a change in the status quo towards either reducing the negative effects or solving a problem, so reducing the extent of the problem, or increase opportunities that might arise from the problem. So here we also should keep in mind that climate change, of course, is a huge issue and will pose existential challenges to humanity, but at the same time, we might also observe positive effects that might or should be leveraged while thinking about adaptation. And importantly, adaptation planning relies significantly on this theory of change, so a set of hypotheses on what is expected to change and how because of the intervention. And this is something that should be made explicit at the beginning of adaptation projects, because otherwise, in insight, it's often difficult to reconstruct this pathway of change. There's, of course, a time dynamics into innovation processes and adaptation planning. We generally start from a baseline condition that where we assess our problem or opportunities. We have an intervention and then some outcomes. But what's important here is that outcomes are usually what we observe at the end of a project, like MountResilience or maybe Sustain Era, but these are not yet impacts, and impacts are really those effects that are bound to last beyond the project duration, and this is something that often proves challenging. So quite often we see that actions are put in place within a project, and then at the end of the project, they become unsustainable because of resources, so there could be time, financial resources, or other type of issues. Moving to our impact assessment framework, we mostly rely on two sources for evidence. One is the regional data collection plans that have been co-developed with our 6 regions, and then 2 waves of representative household surveys. The data collection plans, as I said, were co-created with local partners, and we want to put a significant highlight on this, on the fact that in order to establish shared data foundation across regional demonstrators, but also within regional demonstrators, it's important to have this process of co-creation, so really involving different stakeholders and different possibly interest groups in defining what should be measured and for what reason. And these also help us identifying indicators, database, and feasible monitoring processes, because we also know that quite often we encounter these theoretical approaches to measurement that then are really not feasible or not sustainable in the region specifically, because this depends a lot on the existing infrastructure and ability of stakeholders in actually monitoring what's going on the ground. And we tend to favor these sort of existing indicators, databases, and etc., and limit as much as possible the creation of new data because in order to favor continuity and comparability beyond the project. So once again, the issue we quite often have is that data are collected within the project, and then at the end of the project, if there's no more funding specifically or human resources, we might just lose the ability to monitor the long-term effects, which especially in climate change research are typically slow to realize or to materialize, especially when we talk about environmental effects. Our co-creation process lasted the last 2 years, but particularly started this spring with bilateral online workshop with each of our regions, where we introduced concepts and mapped existing local data sources with a presentation somewhat similar to what I'm giving to you. So also the issue quite often is how to translate these concepts to local administrators, on which we critically rely to obtain the data or to carry out measurement on the ground. And here we tried to include as much as possible internal stakeholders, but also invited them to include external local partners to capture these different perspectives, with the idea that if we miss certain viewpoints, we will not be able to measure them, and then the whole measurement process, or especially when it comes to issues of justice, might be flawed by missing voices in the conversation. So this process went on basically until very recently. The final data collection plans were achieved in Kilpisjärvi this September. We had this consortium meeting in Lapland, where we had sort of the chance to meet in person finally and discuss together with the regions the theory of change, which then in turn determine what should be measured and the timelines and the frequency, and both, so what we wish to measure and what we can measure, which often, unfortunately, are somewhat different. We'll give you a quick overlook of our typology of indicators. So we, according to the slide I was showing you before, we divide our indicators among baseline, structure, process, and outcome indicators. So baseline indicators mostly are those that provide reference or context to the specific projects that the partners are working on, but are not expected to change directly because of the intervention. So they sort of serve as this sort of background condition monitoring that inform our evaluation, but not really enter directly the impact assessment because they're not impact themselves. And then we have the structure, process, and outcomes. So as I said, quite often the focus is put overwhelmingly on outcomes, but we also want to include this structural improvement in regional governance systems that, of course, are, again, shaped along technological or governance improvement or infrastructure improvement. And structure indicators measure all those elements that increase system readiness to shocks, or just, climate change is not per se a shock, it's more this slowly unfolding shock. And adaptive capacity, so in general, the capacity of a system to not bounce back, but rather arrive to a new harmony with the changed climate. Then we have all these process indicators that try to assess whether the intervention followed the plan. So this is more the monitoring part, but specifically include also all those side effects that might affect a variety of stakeholders. And here we also try to include different perspectives and ensure procedural justice. So the fact that not only the outcomes, not only monitoring the outcomes, but also monitoring whether all the relevant stakeholders were involved in a proper way in the co-creation process of these interventions. And finally, the outcomes, this is more traditional. So they are really sort of what we wish to see changed at the end of a project, or in the following years, or even decades in some cases, depending on the type of indicators. The indicators can also then be characterized along these 4 assessment domains. So we have environmental, economic, and societal domains, which are somewhat more traditional. And then we decided to explicitly include governance and politics to capture, like we could characterize these as all those indicators that work mostly on these structural elements of adaptation. So all those changes in institutions and governance systems that strengthen regions in answering the challenges or capturing the opportunities of climate change. The second part of, or the second data source of our impact assessment are the representative outer surveys. We will conduct 2. One was already conducted at the end of 2024 in each of the 6 regions. And these serve as a sort of baseline condition, so to see the conditions before the project actually started being implemented. And then we will have a second wave in late 2026. And the idea is to basically compare the outcomes from these surveys and try to establish whether there is some causality that we can spot because of MountResilience. Even though like the focus of these representative outer surveys is also to capture local priorities of citizens and policy preferences in general. So these also enter later on our impact assessment. A few data about the outer surveys. They were covering approximately 50 questions per country, and the question lasted approximately 20 minutes. I think on median, it took 18 minutes for each respondent to answer, and they cover our variety of topics. I'm just mentioning some here: perceptions of climate change, trust in institutions, policy preferences specifically about climate change, but also a bit wider, pro-environmental behavior, so those actions that citizens already take themselves to sort of mitigate their carbon footprint or handprint, and private actions, private adaptation action that they might take. As I said, there are 50 questions, so it's difficult to represent all of them, but we can also, I'm happy to answer more questions on what we covered in the survey. And the survey was translated in 9 local languages, including 3 Sami dialects, which are, I mean, I guess being from Estonia, you're probably familiar with Sami. They are this indigenous population inhabiting northern Scandinavia, so across Norway, Sweden, Finland, which is our region, and Russia. As I said, this formed the social data backbone of MoRIA. So really, through the data collection plan, we basically involved these major institutions. So in some way, that can be companies or tourist boards or municipalities. So this sort of middle level of institutions. But then we also want this sort of more bottom-up approach, really trying to directly get in contact with this large number of citizens. Yeah, in the end, in the first survey, we had more than 2,000 answers, more or less 500 per region, which should guarantee a quite strong representativeness of the sample. How do we pass from evidence to our final impact assessment? So we have a variety of data that can be quantitative or qualitative. And for those data that are both quantitative and have target levels, so where the local partners were able to tell us, okay, we would like this certain amount to observe this certain amount in this indicator by the end of the project, we construct a MoRIA index. I will not go too much into detail of the technical aggregation, but basically it is an index moving from 0 to 1 that then aggregates across the different dimensions and types of indicators to obtain basically a unique score. So this classical quantitative scoring strategy. What's important here, we include domain weights from citizen surveys. We can also come back to this with a specific example. Basically, the idea here is that we ask respondents what objectives are most relevant for them, or in terms of policy priorities. And this could be, for example, more environmental objectives, more economic objectives like preserving jobs or increasing incomes, or more social aspects like just redistribution of resources, or I guess that's more or less it. I feel like, yeah. Anyway, and basically these weights then are elicited directly from the surveys and help us weighting different effects we might observe in the regions. On the other hand, we have this strong commitment to not only reduce everything to this, numeric index, but really try to argue for the fact that effects are also very context dependent, and contextuality of results is quite often captured better by these qualitative narratives, and especially when we talk about, for example, power dynamics. And so these impact narratives rely on the stakeholder network analysis done by other colleagues, and we'll try in the end to really provide these all-round pictures of the innovation process occurred within each of the regions. And the final aim is to be able to compare results across regions without reducing them to, without losing the local specificity of each of the interventions. I wanted to show you also, so far, what I present so far, it's mostly what we are required to do within the project. And then as sort of spin-off, also as part of my PhD research, we're now also working on academic publications, 2 at the moment. So the first one focuses on willingness to pay for local adaptation. And here the question is, what motivates most citizens across the regions and within the regions to contribute to a climate adaptation fund to finance these initiatives or general projects in climate adaptation. And particularly, we want to look at the role of trust and perceived importance of climate change adaptation in shaping willingness to pay, and the role of pro-environmental behaviors and risk perception in the same. In terms of design, we use this double-bounded dichotomous choice model. Again, this can get quite technical. We can delve into it if you're interested. And what I find interesting is also we adopt these 4 scenarios. So of course, the idea is, the hypothetical scenario we posed them was contributing to this regional climate adaptation fund, but then there's the question of how the fund would be financed. So either through a tax or a voluntary payment, and who would administer this fund. So this could be an independent body, as in many countries happens, or a political body, like an elected body, which could be the government, the regional government, the city municipality, or a specially appointed body. And already covered the sample. So just to give you some taste of our early findings, we see, for example, the willingness to pay, which in general, I mean, it's literally this willingness to pay for adaptation, but it's also somewhat of a proxy for how much people do care about adaptation, even though this can be contested. And I'm also happy to discuss this. And for example, we see that adaptation tends to decline with age, and it's typically lower in men. This is very common in literature. So the fact that older generations tend to show less interest in climate policy, of course, depends on income and education levels. So this is also somewhat not so new. What we investigate more is attitudes and perceptions. So we see that there's somewhat of a difference between expressing climate concern, so the concern for climate change, and actually supporting adaptation, which is captured by this perceived importance of adaptation, which is a way stronger predictor in regression models. And then among the trust variables, we see that trust in NGOs, science, and businesses is associated with increased willingness to pay compared, for example, to governments or more traditional administrators, and as well the role of media, that typically people consuming traditional media seems to show higher awareness about climate change in general. This is in line with disinformation, like this emerging disinformation through these channels, which are not controlled by any entity, for example. So, you know, typically Telegram, Instagram, whatever. We see that cultural loss seems to be relevant here. So the fact that whenever people perceive that climate change is threatening their cultural identity, they show a positive effect in terms of willingness to pay. There are different behavioral factors that play a role here. And particularly here, I will come back to this in our second paper, but we see that those changes that relate mostly with possibly economic improvements. So the fact, for example, to adopt energy efficient appliances do not show higher support for adaptation. So this possible crowding out effect, while those pro-environmental behaviors that are more sort of value driven, like dietary change or more significant investment in greening your house or nature-based solutions in general, tend to increase willingness to pay. We also have some special effects. I will not go into this because then we need to go country by country, but a general takeaway that we see from this line of research is that public good-oriented and co-produced adaptation seems to crowd in willingness to pay, while purely private and cost-saving actions tend to crowd it out. So somewhat of a complex relationship between even adopting more environmental friendly behaviors and the really type of behavior. So what kind of motivates people to adopt these behaviors. This is just a graph basically showing what I just detailed. And what we also see here, we're focusing on how the different scenarios, so whether the fund would be managed by, for example, voluntary payments or tax payments, and whether the fund would be managed by an independent body or a government body. The effect of this changes quite significantly across countries. What we expect in general from literature is that people do not like taxes and would prefer voluntary payment. And this is true across many regions. But then we see, for example, the case of Lapland. So in the top center graph, that there is this opposite relationship. So the voluntary scenarios are actually the ones collecting the least willingness to pay, while clear, tax-driven and even political bodies managed funds seem to show higher preference. So the bottom line here is how, for example, such a fund should be structured probably depends a lot on the specific local circumstances and a lot on, for example, trust toward the government and these sort of social citizenship aspects. In general, we might argue, for example, Finland is a country where citizens tend to be more trust more government compared to Italy, where I come from, where there's generally very skepticism and all these corruption scandals and etc. that tend to undermine political management of such initiatives. Second application that presented last year is this research on the differences on these dynamics between urban and rural communities. Here we take sort of a step back and we try to determine what mostly predicts higher perceived importance of climate change adaptation, and how this is shaped by different constructs. So awareness of climate change, concern for climate change, trust in institutions, and place, so specifically where people live. And in terms of spatial dynamics, we investigate this urban versus rural and mountains versus plain. Probably the urban-rural is relevant to all of you, mountain versus plain less. But as I will argue in a second, there's actually good news for you. So conceptual framework in general to this research is we see there's a lot of research going on at the moment on the effects of civic trust and participation, and on climate change policy, the center-periphery divide, which is something that was formulated outside of climate change politics, but now it's really entering this debate. And this gap between the perception of a risk, so being aware of a risk, doesn't necessarily translate into acting on the risk and actually engaging, for example, supporting climate policy. And this is a bit of a more, I would say, complex model. It comes mostly from environmental psychology, so it's also a bit of an experimentation for me. But basically what we're trying to do here is to construct this whole chain of events. So from the moment one individual is aware of a problem, how he becomes aware, and how they shape their concern around the problem, and there's risk perception. And this is then in turn, or this is what I'm trying to test, is mediated by trust. So how they trust the information provider, but also institutions to act on the problems. And this will shape their final support for climate change adaptation policy, or, I mean, I work mostly on adaptation. It's probably similar for what concerns mitigation. And this in turn, like this support for actually acting on the problem, then might translate into individual pro-environmental behaviors or private adaptation measures. You have some quotes on the right, just to show how this theme has been really predominant the last couple of years at least. Again, this becomes a bit of a complex econometric model then, between econometrics and structural equation modeling. What I wanted to show you here, it's still the last step we take in this analysis is also to do this latent class analysis. So basically to statistically construct from the population some subgroupings that might show different adaptation profiles. So what this means is, for example, we might in the end find out, okay, young individuals that tend to be highly educated, etc. So we have sort of a profile of a subgrouping in population, show these dynamics, and this might change quite a bit across different subgroupings. So also recognizing that when we talk about citizens and population, we're not talking about this uniform group, but really about heterogeneous entities, somewhat can dialogue with the concept of milieux in political sciences and social sciences. And then we statistically basically establish where each of our respondents would fall into these endogenous subgroupings. Some of our preliminary findings is that concern and trust are central drivers of climate adaptation, but they don't necessarily translate into behavior. So we find renewed evidence of this concern action gap. We see that place matters, but not as much as we expected, and in particularly urban-rural differences matter way more than mountainous versus plain context, which maybe is good news for you because you don't have mountains. So yeah, this might be even more relevant for you then. And in terms of policy implications of this, we see that generally we should focus more on supporting behavioral uptake and not just informing the public. And this also goes into this perception that quite often when we talk with politicians or people outside of academia, they focus a lot on people are not aware of the problem, and that's the problem. But actually, I mean, this is also, besides our questionnaire, something we see in, for example, EU Silk surveys. People in Europe especially are very well aware of climate change. And this is, I would argue, this is not the problem really informing the public, but rather to support behavioral uptake. So once you are aware of the problem, how do you deal with this? And this sense of giving citizens the sense of agency or possibilities to actually become active and actively shape their lifestyles, or even become ideally active in active actors of change. Generally, we see that if we need to pick one subgrouping, we have these young, engaged individuals, so individuals that show higher willingness to engage in this sort of pro-environmental behaviors can act as multipliers if they're given the chance. So again, here an idea could be to actually support initiatives by this subgroup of the population. And finally, that policy should, of course, be place sensitive and targeted to specific local conditions, but also on the other end, we shouldn't overemphasize differences. Of course, we should take them into account, but then in the end, also we see a lot of common findings across countries, so there's a high potential to sort of cross-contaminate each other across projects, across initiatives, across countries, and etc. I think I'm right on time. So just to summarize some of the what we covered today, we see that MoRIA tries to be this evidence-based and context-sensitive evaluation framework that sort of moves beyond these purely technical measurements by linking indicators and narratives of change. So I think this narratives of change element, or especially the conjugation of the two, is what sometimes is missing. So we either have very quantitative and a bit place sensitive approaches, or these very qualitative approaches, which then fail to be really comparable across cases. And so this is what we're trying to do here. Show you a bit about our empirical studies. I'm happy to answer more questions about this. And in general, what we consistently find in our research is this huge effect of trust and participatory governance as a key driver of citizen engagement in policy. And beyond mountains, is specifically for you. I think these principles are, I mean, our research is, of course, somewhat based on mountains populations, but we really don't have the impression that these findings are limited to this. Of course, there should be some testing on to what extent the same findings, like the effects might change in terms of size, but general rule of thumb should remain similar. That's all. I forgot to say in the beginning, I'm presenting this research, but this was done in collaboration with my colleague Anna Franziska Kalorn, who is also PhD candidate at my department, and our supervisor, Michael Getzner. And I have some references you can look into.
Great. Amazing. Oh, thank you so much. That was super interesting. So, and luckily we also have time for questions. So who wants to go first? Yes, Haliki, please go ahead.
Thanks so much. I'm always asking questions. Tommaso, thank you so much for the brilliant presentation, first of all, and sorry that I was a little bit late. So I hope I didn't miss anything. I think your especially the way you've set up the project is really relevant for us and super useful. So there's a lot to learn from us. I just wanted to ask maybe more personally about your experience in, for example, setting up the survey. If you could tell us like what went well, where did you have difficulties, what maybe some behind the scenes information that could be useful for a sustained era. Because I know that we discussed this a little bit in person once, and I think it would be useful for everyone.
Thanks a lot, Kaliki. I was recently reflecting with my colleague Anna on the process, and I think two takeaways or two lessons learned for us in also setting up the next survey would be one, to not try to come up with original questions so much. I think there's, especially for constructs that are already measured, like socioeconomic aspects and etc., there's already standard formatting of questions. For example, from EU Silk, they cover a lot of different topics. And I think it's, especially in terms of research, it's really useful to try to use, for example, exactly the same wording, because then it's easier to have comparability across cases. And what we did a bit, in Insight naively, was to come up with our questions. And then, of course, the question of, is this really the same question, becomes bigger. And the second thing is, we set out with this a bit exploratory approach. So we pose questions about a lot of different constructs, which I think on the one hand allowed us to be more free than India to decide what to work on more specifically in terms of research. But in Insight, I would have decided a bit more strongly theoretical construct that we want to measure, and then really target the questionnaire on this. So just to clarify, we basically asked a bit about everything, and I think in the end would have been more useful to really start from this theory of change and say, okay, what it is that we really want to measure, and then focus a bit more on those topics. And very final comment, so our questionnaire is really big. It's 20 minutes for it was the first time I ran a survey. I think 20 minutes for a survey, it's a long time, and respondents tend to lose focus and etc. What we didn't do, but we will definitely do next time, is also to include every now and then these sort of probatory questions. So these are sort of these questions that are, I would say, very stupid questions, like, on what planet do you live? And then you can see whether people are just clicking through or really paying attention still. And this is useful to include every, maybe 5 minutes or so, to make sure that people are consistently engaged with the survey. But I would encourage to do shorter surveys in general.
Thank you. This is super useful. Any other questions? Yes, Kai, please go ahead.
Okay, I try from the phone. Do you hear me?
Yeah, we can see you and we can hear you really well.
Oh, great. Thank you for the interesting talk. I was thinking of a lot of things, but now I forgot my question. That about the transformation. Transformation is something that I come from adult education area, and the transformational theory of Mezirov is very important there. And in the transformation, we usually have something that triggers it, some kind of disruption.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of disruptions did you get in the qualitative research that really triggers people to think differently or start to behave differently? Did they mention any kind of transformative moments?
I think here we have somewhat of a biased starting point, because we work on regions that already decided to undertake this process of innovation. So our regions work on very different topics, but for each of them, there's something that is really, I would say, critically endangering their local economies or local livelihoods. Maybe 2 examples could be, I don't know, we work with Tyrol, where their economy relies a lot on winter tourism. And the shock that maybe you're referring to could be the fact that it's evident to everyone that winter tourism, especially in the Alps, has no future. And then, like, if I understand correctly, your argument would be people only change when they really need to change. And I think that we are arrived at the moment. It's clear for many years now that, for example, winter tourism in the Alps will disappear. And then we are forced to, radically change the whole system, because of course, winter tourism, for example, is a specific sector, but then everything is then connected to this specific strategic industry in terms of livelihoods and security of welfare system, etc. Or, for example, we work with Piedmont, and Piedmont which is this region in northwest Italy, there's been recurring droughts. Specifically there we work on the agricultural sector. And in 2022, there was this very significant drought in which I think 70% of agricultural GDP was lost. And this is the sort of, like we will face always more the sort of events that trigger change in people, not only because, out of value driven, like this love for climate or love for environment, but really out of the fact that livelihoods by now are really endangered critically by these developments of climate change. And I think what the trigger is in each specific region might change, but we see always more this fundamental existential threat to regional identities and regional economies and regional livelihoods in general that will trigger this process of innovation. And maybe a final comment here is, but of course, it's not given that then regions engage in transformative adaptation. And what we see a lot is this more tendency to incremental adaptation, which is easier and somewhat more politically accessible, I would argue. So for example, in the case of winter tourism, the first reaction that we always have is, okay, let's invest in better technology to create snow, which only solves the problem for a few years, but then the problem is there again. And I think, typically what I see, this is really a personal impression, is that, of course, regions and politicians and, like governance systems in general tend to first invest in the least transformative things, but then eventually they do realize that those, incremental transformation with incremental adaptation will not get out of the woods, and actually the problems become bigger at the same time. So that's my hope for the fact that people might then engage in, or systems might engage in transformation. But of course, it's a very challenging process, and of course we need then to put in communication stakeholders with very different priorities, but also very different understanding of the problem and language that they use to describe the problem, and etc. Hope this answers a bit.
Thank you, Tommaso. What I was thinking really with this transformation concept, it is used also in within this adaptation and transformation, like a level that adaptations are something that maybe people are doing more, little agents are doing, but transformation is something that is done like institutionally. That is like a one view to it. And another view is what I was asking first, that that view that comes through each individual, that we have to feel some kind of disruption in that we can't continue the way we did, like ethically or morally, or a feeling that we're stuck, that there is no way, and then we change something, start to do totally differently. Like I just wanted to denote these two things, and probably I think what is very interesting is, especially in the countrysides, but probably in towns even more, but this agency that some ways, whether the transformation is something that is in the hands of institutions, or whether it is in the hands of individuals, and how it is dealt in different locations. Because I think that in the countryside, some ways it is more in our hands than in towns.
Tommaso, would you like to say something in response to Kai, or?
I will answer very quickly, and then we want to leave the word to Liska left. I mean, I see better now your question, and I think for me the answer is clearly, when we talk about transformation, we're talking about this system-wide restructuring of, for example, a region or a country, can be then applied to different. And I think there is really about the question of power. So who has the power to make a change? And I think this goes a bit into this second paper I was trying to. What I would like to argue there is the fact that the issue is not really that people don't want to change or don't know that we have a problem. I think the issue is really that they don't have a way to act on the problem. And this is, of course, then something that depends a lot on institutions. And in institutions, I mean, not only, for example, public sector, but really, this larger conception of institutions, particularly economic power, which in the end is what shapes the most transformation. And of course, then, that changes a bit across different governance regimes and governance cultures. But of course, when we talk about transformation and system-wide perspectives, we cannot rely on citizens to do all the heavy lifting. Usually, who should do the heavy lifting is those structures that have the power over how we produce, we live, and etc. We source our food, or etc.
But Thomas, it's all kind of related because if you think about those governance structures, they are democratically elected. And actually in Tallinn, which is the capital of Estonia, where it's just sort of like we had local elections last month, and there are still negotiations between different political parties, in terms of like what kind of coalition will be built. And it's an ongoing discussion because it's been democratically elected by the people, but at the same time, the most likely coalition will not care about those sort of like, I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't say they don't care about sustainability, but they don't care so much about like well-built urban space, which is like green and people can feel good and, less cars, which is of course good for climate as well. So it's more like, yes, car drivers should have priority and, we should do everything in order to avoid traffic jams. So what I'm trying to say is it's all related because the same people choose the leaders who in turn are kind of sort of like do what the people who elected them wanted them to do. So it's, and part of a population is going to be extremely unhappy about it. So, but this is how democracy works. Yeah, it is just a comment.
I think we had, thanks a lot. I think we had another hand raised.
Yeah, yes, Leif is going to ask a question, yes.
Yeah, thanks for an interesting and clear presentation. I was also thinking about this, let's say, planned versus unplanned changes issue. Of course, there are some changes that are planned, let's say, politically or in government, or local government, so on. Probably there are some changes people do consciously, or at least they notice these changes. And then there are probably also such changes that they just adapt. They uh, start acting in a different way. It is feasible in the new context, but it's not very planned or even noticed. So, what do you think? How far or how in-depth can you go along this, let's say, formal, informal axis in terms of your methodology? And is there something to think through based on that? Probably you can capture these changes only to an extent, yes.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, I think this issue of informality, of course, comes a lot also across different countries and cultures. So generally, as a rule of thumb, I would say, okay, Nordic countries tend to have this more democratic and centrally planned industrial policies, for example, or a bit more planning. While I don't know, a country where I come from, Italy, there's a lot of this informal change happening all the time, and a lot of it is, then there's also the question of what we mean by informal, and there's even the issue of things that are simply not legal or not captured, and then this becomes bigger and bigger in terms of, especially methodologically, to collect data on different developments within the population. I would argue there that, for example, qualitative approaches are way more suited to capture those changes that are informal, both through, focus group surveys might reach these subgroups of population that might not otherwise be reached, but again, that'd be difficult. Experts are typically the people that can relate to these changes or might know these changes. But in general, I would say, of course, there's a lot of nuances that are not captured by numbers, especially certain measurement strategies. And this is something I think, we should deal with a lot in assessing impact and measuring impact, in the sense of when we rely on this purely technocratic or technological account of change that only rely on data that can be measured, we miss probably 90% of the picture. Now I'm, just coming up with numbers, but this is a real challenge. And of course, then the question is also how, formal change is a bit easier to track, how, changes in regulations and laws happen. Of course, when we talk about informal norms or how people act and behaviors, this becomes, again, very nuanced. And also there, maybe going back to Aliki's question in the beginning, I think also, for example, relying on these disciplines that really that have worked longer with this sort of populations or these sort of changes. So, for example, psychology, sociology, and etc. It's very important in order to bring in this knowledge, which is often not really, possible to reduce to a set of numbers or a data set, but really requires this more, theoretical engagement with topics. But then, of course, the question is, would the European Commission really accept these? And, there's of course a lot of issues of power and, what is knowledge and etc. Here we go down a rabbit hole.
We are broadly on the same page, and actually European Commission funds also exploratory research and then qualitative research. So it would be interesting to combine. Thank you.
Yeah, great.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. A great question. So we've got like 1 minute left. So unless I see any other hands, I can't see any hands. Let me check. If not, let's finish in time. I'm sure people are busy. So thank you, Tommaso, once more. It was really, really interesting and super useful for our project. And I hope you will be happy with us putting this video online. I'm sure Kertu discussed this with you, but just to make sure, but this is something we can discuss offline as well. So thank you. And all the best with your PhD research.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Nice to meet all of you.